Okay, let's look at Standard 23, Substandard B. Describe the political impact of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Include the impact on civil rights legislation. Two things: political impact of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then this impact on civil rights legislation. So our focus here is on the assassination of John F. Kennedy and its impact on civil rights legislation. So here it is. Here are our elements here. Assassination of President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and impact on civil rights legislation. Civil rights and political and social interactions are the elements and themes. Okay. This guy here, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot and killed, assassinated President John F. Kennedy. That's the assassination. And this guy was killed, I think, 2 days later by a guy by the name of Jack Ruby, who caught the police leading him out of the hospital or out of a building, I can't remember, but shot and killed him. But anyway, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated in Dallas, Texas. See the Dallas police sign there? President John F. Kennedy. And a commission was instituted to investigate this assassination to see if Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone or if he acted in conjunction with other people. Earl Warren, that we talked about in the Warren court, before he was put on the court, he actually led the commission to investigate while he was on the court, I believe. Oswald acted alone in assassinating Kennedy. This is the Warren Commission. Oswald acted alone in assassinating Kennedy, and he fired 3 bullets. One bullet missed Kennedy's limousine altogether, and then another one struck Kennedy in the back of his neck, and then the third bullet hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. Now, this assassination of President John F. Kennedy shocked the United States. People grieved over this. People were on TV crying over it. I mean, for a long period of time, people just total shock. President Kennedy had been assassinated. African Americans were really shocked by it because, if you recall, only 5 months earlier, President Kennedy had promised sweeping civil rights legislation. And in June 1963, and it was in August 1963 that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched on Washington, D.C. and made his I Have a Dream speech. And so in November, 5 months after this, 2 months after King's I Have a Dream speech, he's assassinated. But here he is asking for Congress after the Alabama deal. Here he is he's saying his speech after George Wallace refused to allow students into the University of Alabama. He gave this speech to the public and said that he was going to ask for legislation. Here he is.
I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. This seems to me to be an elementary right. Its denial is an arbitrary indignity that no American in 1963 should have to endure, but many do.
So he tells the public he's going to ask for sweeping civil rights legislation that ends Jim Crow, that ends segregation in the United States. But then he's assassinated in November, 5 months later. A lot of people were kind of disgruntled about this. But the impact that his assassination has, President Lyndon Baines Johnson here is immediately sworn in on Air Force One in Dallas, Texas, with Jackie Kennedy here, President John F. Kennedy's wife, standing next to him. He's sworn in as President of the United States. He was the Vice President, according to the Constitution. If something happens to the President, the Vice President is immediately sworn in as President and then acts in the role of President. And so this assassination of John F. Kennedy is going to put Lyndon Baines Johnson in a position of power, and it is President Johnson that is going to ask Congress to push through this civil rights legislation in honor of President John F. Kennedy and his request. And so we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we discussed already, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and here's President Lyndon Johnson signing those into law. and there's Martin Luther King Jr. standing behind him, as President Kennedy promised he was going to ask Congress for. And so Johnson, in his State of the Union address in January of '64, the following year, January, he asked Congress to let this session be the Congress. I tell you what, I'll let him do it. Here you go.
Last year's congressional session was the longest in peacetime history. And with that foundation, let us work together to make this year's session the best in the nation's history. Let this session of Congress be known as the session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined.
So he asked for it to be known for civil rights more than in the last 100 sessions. Alright, so he's going to ask in the State of the Union address for passage. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was already in the House of Representatives at the time he was making the State of the Union address. And I want to point out some of these quotes he made. He says, all members of the public should have equal access to the facilities open to the public. He's referring here to African Americans should have access to public facilities. Should not be kept from white public facilities here. And so this is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that he's requesting for. And then he says, all Americans of all races stand side by side in Berlin and Vietnam. They died side by side in Korea. Surely they can work and eat and travel side by side in their own country. He's talking about Jim Crow laws, segregation, where you can't eat together, you have to be separated in society. And he's asking for, in January 1964, passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we've already talked about the details of, but we'll do it here again. This law is going to outlaw discrimination in public places. No more hotels saying we don't serve your kind to black people. Prohibited discrimination in government agencies that receive federal funding. Can't keep those federal fundings from African Americans. And then prohibited discrimination in hiring based on race and other factors like color, religion, sex, and national origin. And then Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate any types of discrimination in hiring. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he asked for that to be passed, and we're going to listen to his State of the Union in just a few minutes. So Congress is going to pass this Civil Rights Act. And then in his speech he also says all members of the public should have an equal chance to vote. Here. And we talked about all the ways that Southerners tried to resist African Americans from voting, like the grandfather clause, the poll tax, the literacy test, the white primaries. And he says that all members of the public should have an equal chance to vote for public officials and send their children to good public schools. And there he's talking about this segregation in schools. This is 64. This is 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, but he's referring to the resistance there, and people need to end that resistance and let these African American children into good public schools. But in that we see that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to be passed, that suspended literacy test and grandfather clause, anything resisting African American vote. And so as a result of that, we talked as a consequence of this law passing, and then federal officials are going to be sent there to register African Americans in places that had a record of keeping African Americans. And a result, a consequence, that in southern states, more African Americans registered to vote than prior to that time. So let's listen to the different parts of the speech where he talks about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Let me make one principle of this administration abundantly clear. All of these increased opportunities in employment and education and housing, and in every field, must be open to Americans of every color.
That's Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother.
As far as the writ of federal law will run, we must abolish not some, but all racial discrimination. For this is not merely an economic issue, or a social, political, or international issue. It is a moral issue, and it must be met by the passage this session of the bill now pending in the House. All members of the public should have equal access to facilities open to the public. All members of the public should be equally eligible for federal benefits that are financed by the public. All members of the public should have an equal chance to vote for public officials and to send their children to good public schools and to contribute their talents to the public good. Today, Americans of all races stand side by side in Berlin and in Vietnam. They died side by side in Korea. Surely they can work and eat and travel side by side in their own country.
And so the assassination of John F. Kennedy helps President Lyndon Johnson push through the civil rights legislation that President Kennedy asked for. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that ends segregation and Jim Crow in the South, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that got rid of all those things to keep African Americans from voting or registering to vote. Alright, so describe the political impact of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Include the impact on civil rights legislation. I think we've done that. Right. Ask questions in class. Good luck on the quiz, the test, and the EOCT.